The headlines are wrong. For months, the Black Sea was portrayed as a peripheral theater, a zone of limited consequence. Last night proved otherwise. Moscow executed what I call the Black Sea Escalation Maneuver, a coordinated assault involving 450 drones and 30 missiles that is not a tactical skirmish, it is a historic strategic inflection point. 3 Turkish commercial vessels burned at Chornomorsk, while hypersonic Kinjal missiles and saturation drone waves crippled Ukrainian port and energy infrastructure. Turkey, a NATO member entrusted with regional security, suffered direct operational impact, exposing Western deterrence failures in real time. This is not media spectacle or TV punditry. The Black Sea is a decisive choke point for trade, grain exports, and military mobility. Moscow's actions simultaneously send messages to Ankara. Your mediation and maritime control are conditional to Brussels and Washington. Collective defense has limits, and to Kiev, your maritime lifelines are increasingly isolated. Energy grids collapse, nuclear safety margins erode, and NATO cohesion faces an immediate test. In the following analysis, we will break down exactly how this maneuver unfolded, why Turkish vessels were targeted, the operational calculus behind missile, drone, and electronic warfare integration, and the broader geopolitical implications. By the end, you will understand not just what happened, but why it marks a critical shift in the 21st century balance of power. What we witnessed overnight wasn't just another exchange of fire in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. This was something fundamentally different, a coordinated assault involving approximately 450 drones and 30 missiles that transformed the Black Sea from a contested waterway into a potential powder keg involving NATO member Turkey. When Kinzhal hypersonic missiles streaked through Ukrainian skies alongside hundreds of Iranian-derived Jaran-2 drones targeting critical port infrastructure in Odessa and Mykolaiv, we're observing more than tactical strikes. We're watching the architecture of regional stability crack in real time. 3 Turkish container ships, vessels flying the flag of a NATO member, engulfed in flames at Chornomorsk port. Thousands plunged into darkness as Ukraine's energy grid sustains yet another devastating blow. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant losing external power for the 12th time since this war began. These aren't isolated incidents. They're interconnected nodes in an escalating pattern that demands our immediate attention and strategic understanding. Turkey's President Erdogan, fresh from meetings with Vladimir Putin, warns that the Black Sea must not become a battlefield, yet as he speaks these words, the waters are already churning with violence. Commercial shipping routes are becoming gauntlets of destruction, and the question isn't whether the Black Sea will become a battlefield, it's whether we can prevent it from becoming the spark that draws NATO directly into this conflict. The timing of this assault, mere hours after Erdogan's diplomatic outreach calling for ceasefires around ports and energy infrastructure, reveals something profound about Moscow's strategic calculus and where this war is truly heading. What happened overnight represents far more than collateral damage or unfortunate targeting errors. When you burn the ships of a NATO ally while simultaneously crippling civilian infrastructure and threatening Europe's largest nuclear facility, you're sending multiple messages to multiple audiences simultaneously. Moscow is demonstrating that it operates by its own rules, that diplomatic overtures mean nothing without Russian consent, and that the conflict's geographic and political boundaries are expanding whether Western capitals acknowledge it or not. To understand why 3 burning Turkish ships matter more than hundreds of previous strikes, we need to step back and examine what the Black Sea truly represents in the grand chessboard of geopolitics, because this body of water has always been where empires collide and where the fate of entire civilizations gets decided. The Black Sea isn't merely a body of water connecting 6 nations. It's a strategic choke point that has defined empires for millennia, from Byzantine Constantinople controlling east-west trade routes to Soviet naval dominance during the Cold War that kept American carriers perpetually at bay. Every major power that has ever sought to control Eastern Europe or project influence into the Middle East has had to grapple with Black Sea geography. And what we're witnessing now is simply the latest chapter in that ancient struggle. Understanding this conflict requires grasping several fundamental realities about Black Sea geopolitics. First, the Montreux Convention of 1936 grants Turkey control over the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, the only passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. This makes Ankara the ultimate arbiter of naval access, a role that gives Turkey outsized influence despite its relatively modest overall military capabilities. During peacetime, commercial vessels pass freely, but during armed conflict, Turkey can close these straits to belligerent warships, while allowing passage to naval vessels returning to home ports. This arcane treaty detail matters enormously, because it means Turkey literally holds the keys to whether Russia's Black Sea Fleet can reinforce or rotate, and whether NATO naval power can enter these waters to support Ukraine. Second, the Black Sea grain corridor that operated from July 2022 until Russia's withdrawal in July 2023 represented one of the few successful diplomatic achievements in this entire bloody conflict. Negotiated through Turkish mediation with UN support, it allowed Ukrainian grain to reach global markets, feeding nations across Africa and the Middle East, stabilizing food prices that had spiked dramatically after Russia's February 2022 invasion, and providing Ukraine with desperately needed revenue, approximately $9.8 billion in exports through the initiative's operation. When Moscow withdrew from that agreement, citing alleged Ukrainian attacks on Russian ships and Crimean infrastructure, it signaled a fundamental shift in strategic approach from limited military operations to comprehensive economic warfare designed to strangle Ukraine's economy while weaponizing global food insecurity against Western resolve. Turkey occupies a unique position in this theater that makes Erdogan's balancing act both possible and perilous. As a NATO member since 1952, Ankara has collective defense obligations and maintains military integration with alliance structures. Yet Turkey has also preserved economic relationships with Russia that other NATO members severed, continuing to import Russian natural gas, maintaining tourism links that brought millions of Russian visitors annually before the war, and keeping diplomatic channels open when other capitals hardened their positions. President Erdogan has positioned himself as the primary mediator in ceasefire negotiations, hosting multiple rounds of talks between Ukrainian and Russian delegations, and maintaining communication channels with both Moscow and Kiev, even during the conflict's darkest phases. The Turkish Navy maintains the strongest naval presence in the Black Sea, with a modern fleet built around frigates, corvettes, and submarines specifically designed for these waters. Turkey controls approximately 27% of the Black Sea coastline and the largest exclusive economic zone, making Ankara not just a gatekeeper but a dominant maritime power in the region. This naval superiority matters because it gives Turkey the theoretical capacity to establish protected shipping corridors unilaterally, to enforce no-go zones, or to challenge Russian naval operations. But doing any of these things would risk direct military confrontation with a nuclear-armed power and potentially drag NATO into a war that no alliance member actually wants. What makes the current situation so dangerous is that all these factors, Turkey's gateway control, its mediation role, its economic ties to Russia, its NATO membership, and its dominant Black Sea naval position, are now colliding simultaneously. The fact that Turkish civilian vessels operated by Cenk Shipping, reportedly carrying food supplies in legitimate humanitarian commerce, became collateral damage in Russian strikes, represents not merely an economic loss or tragic accident. It's a direct challenge to Turkey's mediation efforts, its ability to guarantee safe passage in waters it considers within its sphere of influence, and ultimately to its credibility as both a NATO ally and a power broker capable of managing this conflict's most dangerous dimensions. This brings us directly to the critical question of what exactly happened overnight and what Moscow's operational choices reveal about Russian strategic intent. The scale and sophistication of Russia's overnight operation reveal careful planning and strategic intent that goes far beyond random violence or opportunistic target selection. Let's break down exactly what occurred, how the various weapon systems were employed, and why each component matters to understanding the broader conflict trajectory and escalation dynamics we're now observing. Moscow deployed Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, weapons representing the cutting edge of Russian aerospace technology, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 10 and following unpredictable flight paths that make them nearly impossible to intercept with current Ukrainian air defense systems. These weren't launched haphazardly into random coordinates. They targeted specific infrastructure nodes in Odessa and Mykolaiv, two cities that serve as Ukraine's primary maritime gateways and economic lifelines to international markets. The Kinzhal strikes demonstrated both technological capability and strategic precision, hitting power generation facilities, electrical substations, and port infrastructure with devastating accuracy. Accompanying the hypersonic missiles were more conventional cruise missiles, likely Caliber variants launched from naval platforms and ground-based systems, providing additional strike capacity against hardened targets and overwhelming Ukraine's air defense network through sheer volume. Ukrainian air defense operators face an impossible calculus. Kinzhals arrive with virtually no warning and cannot be reliably intercepted, while cruise missiles can be engaged, but only by expending scarce interceptor missiles that Ukraine cannot replace as quickly as Russia can produce offensive weapons. This asymmetry in production capacity and strategic depth means that even when Ukrainian defenses achieve high success rates, the cumulative attrition favors Russia over extended campaigns. But the most striking element of this assault was the deployment of approximately 450 Geran-2 drones, the Russian-manufactured version of Iran's Shahed-136 kamikaze drones. These relatively simple, slow-moving weapons cost roughly $20,000 to pew out compared to the millions required for interceptor missiles, creating devastating economics that favor the attacker. The drones arrived in waves, overwhelming defensive systems through saturation tactics while targeting lower-value infrastructure that doesn't justify expensive interceptors. This tiered approach, hypersonics against critical nodes, cruise missiles against hardened targets, drones against area infrastructure, represents sophisticated operational planning that maximizes destructive efficiency while minimizing costs. The drones hit Chornomorsk port with devastating precision, igniting 3 Turkish container ships belonging to Cenk Shipping in massive fireballs that lit up the pre-dawn darkness. Eyewitness reports described scenes of chaos as food supplies destined for international markets burned, dock facilities sustained heavy damage, and port operations ground to a halt. Simultaneously, strikes crippled substantial portions of Ukraine's electrical grid, leaving thousands in Odessa and Mykolaiv without power as temperatures dropped toward winter lows. Firefighters battled blazes through the morning, struggling to contain damage that extended far beyond initial impact zones as secondary explosions and structural failures compounded the destruction. Most alarmingly, from a strategic perspective, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest nuclear facility with 6 reactors generating 5,700 megawatts at full capacity, lost external power once again. While the reactors aren't currently operational, they require continuous external electricity to maintain cooling systems for nuclear fuel rods that remain intensely radioactive and heat generating even when shut down. This marks the 12th such power loss since the war began, each incident raising the specter of a radiological catastrophe that would make Chernobyl seem geographically contained by comparison. The repeated nature of these power losses suggests either systematic targeting of the electrical infrastructure supporting the plant or catastrophic degradation of Ukraine's overall grid stability. Neither interpretation offers comfort. The timing of this massive barrage cannot be dismissed as coincidental or operationally convenient. These strikes occurred mere hours after President Erdogan met with Vladimir Putin in diplomatic consultations and called publicly for limited ceasefires around ports and energy infrastructure, precisely the target categories Moscow then proceeded to strike with overwhelming force. This sequencing reveals something crucial about Russian negotiating posture and strategic communication that goes far beyond the immediate tactical results. Moscow is demonstrating that it will engage diplomatically when convenient, but operates according to its own strategic timeline and priorities. That diplomatic overtures from regional powers carry no weight against operational imperatives, and that Russia intends to dictate the terms, pace, and scope of any eventual settlement through military dominance rather than diplomatic compromise. Ukrainian President Zelensky, meanwhile, was at the front lines near Kharkov in the Donetsk region, celebrating Ukraine's Ground Forces Day by handing out awards to soldiers fighting to hold contested territories. Zelensky insisted that Russian supply lines to disputed cities have been severed and that Ukrainian forces maintain tactical initiative despite Russian territorial gains. Ukraine released body camera footage showing intense urban combat as its soldiers fight to retake or hold positions, demonstrating continued battlefield resilience even as strategic pressures mount. Russia's defense ministry countered with its own footage purporting to show Russian troops capturing 8 Ukrainian settlements over the past week, including the strategically significant city of Seversk in the Donetsk region. Moscow claims steady territorial advances across multiple fronts, degrading Ukrainian defensive positions through sustained attritional warfare that leverages Russia's advantages in artillery, ammunition supplies, and manpower reserves. Whether Russian claims prove accurate or represent inflated battlefield assessments, the pattern is clear. Both sides are grinding forward in a war of attrition where tactical gains matter less than cumulative resource depletion and political will to sustain losses. What we're observing isn't random escalation or tactical opportunism. It's a coordinated message being delivered through violence to multiple audiences simultaneously. But to decode that message and understand its implications, we need to examine the strike through the lens of strategic analysis and ask the fundamental question: what is Moscow actually trying to achieve, and why does burning Turkish ships advance those objectives? When you examine this operation through a strategic lens, several critical patterns emerge that reveal Moscow's thinking and the dangerous trajectory this conflict is following. This wasn't simply retaliation for Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory, nor was it opportunistic targeting of vulnerable infrastructure. This was calibrated escalation designed to achieve multiple strategic objectives simultaneously while testing the boundaries of acceptable violence and NATO's willingness to respond when member state interests are directly threatened. First, consider the economic and commercial dimension of striking Turkish vessels engaged in legitimate maritime commerce. By hitting ships flying Turkey's flag, Moscow is testing NATO's cohesion and response mechanisms in the most direct way short of actual military confrontation. Turkey has been the most independent NATO member regarding Russia throughout this conflict, maintaining economic ties other allies severed, continuing energy purchases when European nations sought alternatives, preserving tourism relationships that provide Russia with hard currency, and keeping diplomatic channels open when other capitals adopted maximalist positions. Ankara's balancing act has frustrated hardliners in Washington and Brussels, who view any engagement with Moscow as appeasement. Yet Turkey's unique position has also made Erdogan the only leader capable of mediating credibly between the warring parties. Hitting Turkish ships while they're engaged in humanitarian commerce, transporting food supplies, sends multiple calculated messages. To Turkey, Moscow is saying your mediation efforts mean nothing without Russian consent. Your control of maritime access doesn't extend to operational security in Ukrainian waters, and your NATO membership provides no protection for commercial interests in contested regions. To NATO broadly, Russia is demonstrating that it can attack alliance member assets without triggering collective defense responses, revealing the emptiness of Article 5 guarantees when attacks can be characterized as collateral damage rather than deliberate aggression. To Ukraine, Moscow is proving that no nation will risk direct confrontation to protect Kyiv's maritime access, that international shipping will abandon Ukrainian ports regardless of economic consequences, and that geographic isolation will strangle Ukraine's economy more effectively than any ground offensive. Second, the systematic assault on Ukraine's energy infrastructure continues a campaign that intensified in autumn 2022 and has never truly ceased. Every time Ukraine's electrical grid is degraded, civilian suffering increases exponentially as heating systems fail during winter. Medical facilities lose power, water pumping stations go offline, and the basic functions of modern society collapse. The strategic objective isn't merely to cause suffering, though Moscow clearly accepts that as an acceptable cost, but to make Ukraine ungovernable, to degrade Kyiv's capacity to sustain military operations as logistics and command and control systems lose power, and to create conditions where Ukrainian civilians pressure their government towards settlement rather than continued resistance. The targeting of Zaporizhia's external power supply adds a layer of nuclear blackmail to conventional warfare that should alarm anyone paying attention. Russia controls Europe's largest nuclear facility and can create radiological crises at will simply by degrading the electrical infrastructure that keeps cooling systems operational. Moscow doesn't need to threaten nuclear weapons used explicitly when it can manufacture nuclear emergencies through conventional strikes on civilian infrastructure. This is strategic ambiguity weaponized, creating nuclear risk without nuclear attacks, generating terror and diplomatic pressure without crossing red lines that would trigger Western military response. Third, the timing relative to ceasefire negotiations reveals Moscow's fundamental negotiating posture with crystalline clarity. President Putin met with Erdogan, listened to proposals for limited ceasefires around ports and energy infrastructure, allowed the Turkish president to believe diplomatic progress was achievable, then immediately launched strikes against exactly those protected categories Erdogan had requested. This isn't diplomatic incompetence or bureaucratic miscommunication between Kremlin political leadership and military commanders. This is deliberate demonstration that Russia will negotiate only from positions of overwhelming strength, on its own strategic timeline, and according to terms that reflect battlefield realities rather than diplomatic niceties. The military analyst in me recognizes another crucial factor driving Russian operational tempo: battlefield momentum, and the imperative to consolidate gains before Western military aid packages fully materialize or Ukrainian mobilization efforts bear fruit. Russia claims territorial advances across multiple fronts in Donetsk, capturing settlements and pushing Ukrainian defensive lines back through sustained attritional pressure. When you're winning on the ground or believe you're winning, you escalate to consolidate advances advantages, demonstrate that your opponent lacks capacity to respond effectively, and shape the diplomatic environment to reflect military dominance. Ukraine's fierce resistance tells the complementary story. Body camera footage showing intense urban combat around Kurakovi reveals soldiers fighting desperately to hold or reclaim every meter of contested ground, employing Western-supplied weapons effectively, and maintaining tactical coherence despite strategic pressures. But tactical effectiveness without strategic depth or decisive advantage becomes a recipe for attrition, and attrition favors the side with larger manpower reserves, industrial capacity, and political will to sustain losses indefinitely. What concerns me most as I analyze these patterns is the widening gap between diplomatic rhetoric and operational reality. While Turkey, the United States, and European nations speak earnestly of negotiations, peace frameworks, and humanitarian concerns, the actual conduct of military operations shows both sides preparing for prolonged, intensified conflict with no immediate prospect of settlement. Russian strikes on Turkish vessels occur simultaneous to Turkish-Russian diplomatic meetings. Ukrainian offensives continue while Zelensky discusses ceasefire terms. NATO provides increasingly sophisticated weapons while insisting it's not a party to the conflict. This disconnect between words and actions creates the conditions for catastrophic miscalculation because leaders operate with different understandings of what's actually happening on the ground versus what's being said in diplomatic channels. And when Turkish ships start burning in Ukrainian ports, when NATO member state commercial interests are directly threatened through kinetic action, when nuclear facilities repeatedly lose power amid active combat operations, we're no longer talking about a contained bilateral war between Russia and Ukraine. We're approaching thresholds where a NATO member's vital interests are tangibly threatened, where nuclear safety margins erode to dangerous levels, and where the conflict's geographic and political boundaries expand regardless of anyone's stated intentions to contain it. This brings us to the most dangerous question that military strategists must grapple with, but politicians often avoid. What happens next? And what are the pathways through which this crisis could expand into something far worse? Let me be direct about something most analysts are reluctant to discuss openly in public forums. We are closer to a direct NATO-Russia confrontation than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and the burning of Turkish vessels in Ukrainian waters represents a tripwire that could activate Article 5 consultations if not handled with extraordinary diplomatic care and strategic restraint by all parties involved. Consider the escalation pathways now actively in play. Turkey could demand NATO support for protecting its commercial shipping in the Black Sea, arguing that repeated attacks on civilian vessels flying its flag constitute acts warranting collective consultations under Article 4 or even collective defense responses under Article 5. While Article 5 technically requires an armed attack against the territory, forces, or vessels of a member state, there's considerable interpretive flexibility regarding what constitutes an attack and under what circumstances collective defense obligations activate. Even without invoking Article 5's collective defense provisions, Turkey possesses formidable naval power to establish protected maritime corridors unilaterally. But doing so would place Turkish warships in direct operational proximity to Russian naval and air forces, creating countless opportunities for miscalculation, accidental engagement, or deliberate provocation by either side. Imagine the scenario. Turkish frigates escorting civilian convoys through contested waters encounter Russian aircraft conducting interdiction operations. Who yields? What happens when a Russian missile targeting a Ukrainian port facility strikes near a Turkish warship? At what point does Turkey respond with defensive fire? Once the first shot is exchanged between Turkish and Russian forces, even accidentally, we're in fundamentally new territory where NATO defense obligations and Russian escalation doctrines intersect in ways no one has adequately wargamed or planned for. Alternatively, Turkey could exercise its rights under the Montreux Convention to close the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits to Russian military vessels, citing the existence of armed conflict in the Black Sea region as justification. Such a move would effectively trap Russia's Black Sea fleet, eliminating rotational capabilities, preventing reinforcement from Mediterranean-based assets, and forcing Moscow to choose between accepting strategic encirclement or taking military action against Turkish-controlled territory, which is NATO territory protected by collective defense guarantees. Would Russia accept such isolation of its Black Sea fleet? History suggests major powers don't peacefully accept strategic encirclement of significant military assets, which makes this option extraordinarily dangerous despite its apparent legality. Under international conventions, the nuclear dimension cannot be ignored or dismissed as abstract fearmongering. Zaporizhia's repeated power losses aren't merely technical inconveniences or unfortunate side effects of combat operations. They're manufactured crises that keep nuclear catastrophe hovering just one system failure, one miscommunication, or one cascade cascade event away from reality. Russia knows that European and American leaders fear radiological incidents above almost all other conflict outcomes, except direct nuclear weapons use, by maintaining military control of Zaporizhzhia while allowing its safety margins to degrade through infrastructure strikes. Moscow wields implicit nuclear leverage without ever having to explicitly threaten nuclear weapons employment. The calculation works like this. Every time Zaporizhzhia loses external power, European capitals face renewed pressure to force Ukraine towards settlement rather than risk nuclear catastrophe. Environmental groups, anti-war movements, and risk-averse populations all amplify calls for ceasefire regardless of terms. Russia generates strategic leverage through nuclear fear without crossing the threshold of actual nuclear weapons use that would trigger massive Western response. Its strategic ambiguity weaponized brilliantly, creating nuclear coercion through conventional military operations against civilian infrastructure. Then there's the humanitarian and economic warfare dimension that extends far beyond the immediate combat zone. Ukraine's grain exports don't just generate revenue for Kiev's government, they stabilize global food markets and prevent price spikes that trigger political instability in vulnerable nations across Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. Approximately 400 million people worldwide depend partially or heavily on grain supplies transiting Black Sea ports. By systematically attacking port infrastructure, burning grain shipments, and creating unsafe conditions that drive insurance premiums to prohibitive levels for commercial shipping, Russia isn't just hurting Ukraine economically. Moscow is weaponizing hunger against populations thousands of miles away who depend on Black Sea grain corridors, calculating that food insecurity will translate into political pressure on Western governments to abandon Ukraine rather than sustain a conflict that generates global humanitarian crises. What keeps me awake analyzing these scenarios is the realization that all parties are now operating with incomplete information, heightened threat perceptions, and deteriorating strategic communication. Turkish naval commanders watching their country's civilian ships burn will have fundamentally different risk calculations and threat assessments than they had 48 hours ago. Ukrainian air defense operators already stretched to breaking points, managing multiple simultaneous threats, must now defend against hypersonic missiles that arrive with virtually no warning, while rationing interceptors they cannot replace. Russian military planners, observing NATO weapons flowing into Ukraine in increasing quantities and sophistication, ATAK-AMS missiles, F-16 aircraft, advanced air defense systems, see a conflict where the West is already deeply involved, just fighting through proxies rather than directly with NATO forces. Each of these factors feeds escalation dynamics that are extremely difficult to control once initiated. We've seen this pattern before in history. World War I didn't begin because any major power wanted continental war. It began because crisis management failed, because mobilization schedules created use-it-or-lose-it pressures, because threat perceptions diverged from reality, and because leaders underestimated how quickly limited conflicts could spiral into general war. We're not in 1914, but the mechanisms of uncontrolled escalation remain disturbingly similar when communication breaks down and military logic overrides political wisdom. The question isn't whether leaders understand these risks intellectually. Most do. The question is whether they possess the political will and diplomatic creativity to step back from trajectories already set in motion, to override military imperatives with strategic restraint, and to accept outcomes that will satisfy no domestic constituency completely, but avoid catastrophic outcomes. And this brings us to dimensions of this crisis that often get lost in strategic discussions, but ultimately determine whether populations support or oppose their government's policies in any prolonged conflict. The human cost and global implications that ripple far beyond the immediate combat zone. Behind every statistic we recite, 450 drones, 30 missiles, 3 destroyed ships, thousands without power, there are individual human beings whose lives have been irrevocably shattered, whose futures have been stolen, whose families have been torn apart by violence they didn't choose and couldn't prevent. This isn't sentimentality disconnected from strategic analysis. Understanding the human dimension is essential to grasping how conflicts sustain themselves politically or ultimately collapse when populations withdraw support from governments pursuing unwinnable wars. Thousands of Ukrainians in Odessa and Mykolaiv woke up without electricity this morning. No heating as winter approaches and temperatures drop toward freezing. No refrigeration for food that will now spoil. No power for hospitals treating the wounded from previous strikes or managing chronic illnesses that require continuous care. Children in darkened apartments trying to do homework by candlelight. Elderly citizens in freezing homes, many unable to relocate to areas with functioning infrastructure. Medical facilities running on backup generators with uncertain fuel supplies. Doctors and nurses performing emergency procedures under primitive conditions that increase infection risks and mortality rates. The cumulative psychological toll of repeated attacks, constant air raid sirens, perpetual uncertainty about when the next strike will come. This creates trauma that persists long after physical infrastructure gets rebuilt. Studies from previous conflicts show that populations living under sustained bombardment develop higher rates of PTSD, anxiety disorders, substance abuse, and suicide, even years after fighting ends. We're creating an entire generation of traumatized Ukrainians who will carry these wounds forward, affecting social cohesion, economic productivity, and political stability for decades. The Turkish sailors aboard those 3 container ships at Chornomorsk port, men working honest jobs, transporting food supplies to earn livings and support families back home, suddenly found themselves in a war zone without warning, without preparation, without any meaningful protection. Some surely died in the initial explosions or subsequent fires. Others survived traumatic experiences they'll carry forever, watching colleagues burn, escaping through smoke and flames, enduring injuries that will never fully heal. Their families in Turkey are now part of this conflict's expanding circle of victims, joining the millions of Ukrainians, Russians, and others whose lives have been destroyed or permanently altered since February 2022. These aren't abstract casualties or acceptable losses in some grand strategic game. They're sons, fathers, husbands, brothers, real people with hopes, dreams, responsibilities, and futures that were stolen in an instant by decisions made thousands of miles away by leaders who will never personally face the consequences of their actions. And their deaths matter strategically because they affect Turkish public opinion, Turkish political calculations about NATO membership and relationships with Russia, and ultimately whether Ankara maintains its mediation role or hardens its position toward Moscow. But the consequences radiate far beyond the immediate Black Sea region through mechanisms that aren't always obvious but prove strategically decisive over time. Omar Uskasilchik from the Atlantic Council, speaking from Ankara in expert analysis of these events, articulated Turkey's fundamental concern. Black Sea security is degrading massively, affecting not just Turkey but Bulgaria, Romania, and Georgia, nations whose economic lifelines depend on maritime access through what has historically been relatively stable waters. Commercial shipping companies worldwide are now recalculating risk assessments for Black Sea routes in real time. Insurance underwriters are increasing premiums for vessels transiting these waters, raising costs that get passed through to consumers globally. Some carriers will simply refuse to operate in the region regardless of profit potential, further constricting grain export capacity and driving up global food prices through reduced supply. The Baltic and International Maritime Council has already issued warnings about Black Sea operations, and major shipping companies have begun rerouting cargo through alternative, more expensive routes. Consider the cascading effects on African and Middle Eastern nations dependent on Ukrainian and Russian grain supplies. When prices rise even modestly, governments in import-dependent nations face impossible choices between food subsidies that strain already fragile budgets and allowing price increases that trigger protests, social instability, and potential regime collapse. The Arab Spring of 2011 began partly due to food price spikes driven by commodity speculation and harvest failures. We're creating similar conditions across vulnerable regions where political stability depends on affordable food access. Egypt imports approximately 80% of its wheat consumption, with significant portions historically sourced from Ukraine and Russia. Lebanon, already experiencing economic collapse and political crisis, depends heavily on grain imports that transit Black Sea routes. Tunisia, Jordan, Yemen, dozens of nations where governments lack resources to absorb price shocks or offset costs through subsidies. When bread prices rise, people protest. When protests intensify, governments crack down. When crackdowns fail, regimes fall or states collapse. This isn't theoretical extrapolation. This is the documented pattern from previous food security crises. European energy markets still adjusting to reduced Russian natural gas supplies and seeking alternative sources now watch Turkish-Russian relations deteriorate and wonder whether Ankara will leverage its control of critical energy transit routes as diplomatic tools. Turkey currently serves as a transit hub for natural gas pipelines connecting Azerbaijani and other regional suppliers to European markets. Any disruption to these flows would spike prices further, increase inflation across European economies already struggling with cost of living crises, and generate political backlash against governments supporting continued Ukraine aid. The interconnectedness of modern economic systems means a drone strike in Odessa affects bread prices in Cairo within weeks, political stability in Tunisia within months, and migration pressures on Italy within a year. European leaders watching migration flows from North Africa and the Middle East understand this connection viscerally. They know that food insecurity abroad translates directly into asylum seekers and irregular migrants attempting dangerous Mediterranean crossings. The political backlash from those migration flows strengthens nationalist parties, weakens centrist governments, and erodes European consensus on Ukraine support. The psychological toll extends to populations far from active combat zones. Europeans living in cities that haven't seen warfare since 1945 are increasingly anxious about conflict spreading westward, about direct NATO-Russia confrontation, about whether their governments are leading them toward wars they didn't choose and cannot win. Russian citizens, increasingly isolated from global economic systems and facing mounting casualties with unclear strategic objectives, grapple with whether supporting their government's policies serves national interests or leads toward collective ruin. Americans, geographically distant but financially committed to Ukraine's defense, debate whether continued support serves actual U.S. interests or risks direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed power over issues marginal to American security. These aren't abstract policy questions debated only in think tanks and government offices. They're dilemmas that shape elections, empower political movements, and determine the fundamental question of whether democratic societies can sustain support for distant conflicts when domestic challenges mount and resources feel increasingly scarce. The outcome of Ukraine's war won't be decided primarily by military capabilities or territorial control. It will be decided by whether populations in supporting countries maintain political will to continue providing assistance despite growing costs and unclear paths to favorable outcomes. Which brings us full circle to the ultimate strategic question: where does this end? What can be done to prevent the worst escalation scenarios we've examined, and whether the international community possesses sufficient wisdom and courage to choose difficult compromises over catastrophic alternatives? Let me be completely clear about where we stand at this critical juncture. This conflict has entered a phase where diplomatic solutions become exponentially more difficult, even as military solutions become increasingly catastrophic for all parties involved. The burning Turkish ships aren't just unfortunate collateral damage, they're harbingers of a widening war that threatens to consume the entire Black Sea region and potentially draw NATO into direct confrontation with Russia. The key developments reveal several inescapable strategic truths. First, Russia is winning the attrition battle on the ground through sustained pressure and superior artillery supplies, yet simultaneously losing the broader strategic competition. NATO has expanded, European rearmament accelerates, and Russia faces long-term economic isolation. Russia can capture territory but cannot achieve political objectives, justifying the staggering costs already incurred. Second, Western support for Ukraine remains substantial. Tens of billions in military aid, intelligence sharing, and economic assistance. But that support is increasingly contested domestically as populations grow weary of open-ended commitments and economic pressures mount. The United States faces potential policy shifts, while European unity shows fractures as nations pursue divergent interests regarding Russian relations and energy security. Third, regional powers like Turkey face impossible choices between alliance commitments and national interests. The burning of Turkish ships forces Turkey toward decisions it has avoided for nearly 3 years. Either accept that NATO membership provides insufficient protection, or take actions risking direct confrontation with Russia in a war offering Turkey no meaningful benefits. What's desperately needed is creative diplomacy that acknowledges these harsh realities while identifying off-ramps, allowing all parties to claim acceptable outcomes. Turkey's mediation efforts represent the best hope, but only if backed by serious pressure from Washington and European capitals on Kyiv to consider realistic compromises, and simultaneous pressure from Beijing on Moscow to accept outcomes stopping short of maximalist war aims. The alternative pathways are genuinely frightening. Continued Black Sea escalation could force Turkey into impossible choices that destabilize NATO entirely. Further systematic degradation of Ukraine's energy infrastructure will create humanitarian catastrophes, generating massive migration pressures toward Europe. Most dangerous is the normalization of nuclear brinkmanship around Zaporizhzhia. Every power loss without catastrophic consequences makes leaders slightly more comfortable with nuclear proximity, slightly more willing to accept risks that would have seemed insane months earlier. So what should you, as informed citizens, take away from this analysis? First, demand that political leaders articulate clear, realistic objectives beyond slogans about defending democracy. What specific outcomes justify continued escalation risk? Second, recognize that eventual resolution will require compromises satisfying no constituency completely. Both maximalist positions, total Ukrainian victory, or Russian achievement of all objectives are military fantasies ensuring perpetual war rather than achievable outcomes. Third, understand that the next few months represent a critical window where trajectories get set defining this conflict for years. The decisions being made right now will determine whether by next spring we're discussing post-war reconstruction or preparing for World War III. This isn't hyperbole, this is sober assessment of where current trajectories lead, if not altered through conscious political choices prioritizing de-escalation over victory maximization. The burning Turkish ships matter because they symbolize how quickly limited conflicts metastasize into regional catastrophes when strategic communication fails and military logic overrides political wisdom. We don't have the luxury of surprise this time. The warning signs are clear, the escalation pathways visible, the potential consequences well understood. Stay informed about these developments, stay engaged with policy debates shaping your government's responses, and demand better from those who lead us. Demand clarity about objectives, honesty about costs and risks, creativity in diplomacy, and wisdom in choosing which battles justify fighting them. Because the stakes have never been higher, and the consequences of failure have never been more dire for everyone involved.